Hey, this is Nate from DataFirstInsights.io, and today I'll be talking about DBT and Jinja. So, as you can see over here, and you start to dig into like a DBT repo, you'll see that instead of like the table reference, right, in the SQL code, and right now I'm using BigQuery, you see that instead of typically what it would be just like the database schema, the name of the table, you'll get this like ref over here. And look at the source over here. So ref is one of the best parts of DBT because it keeps projects simple and readable. But as your model's logic and reporting needs grow, scaling a DBT project takes more time than just ref. That's where tools like Jinja, macros, and reusable patterns can help if you use them the right way. So Jinja of itself is a way to write your SQL code in a little bit more abstraction. So what that means is that, if you've worked with Python before, it's a full programming language. You can define functions, write for loops, conditions, logic, and so on and so forth, and set variables. And Jinja is the kind of like the attempt to do that and adding it to SQL. So just making your SQL code a little bit more dry. So today I'll be walking you through how you could just kind of up level your DBT project instead of just using ref or source or, there's things that you've seen so far without much context. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is you can start to see the benefit of adding Jinja because oftentimes when you have like say a bunch of CTs and you're doing a bunch of manipulations on your data, you'll have to kind of like repetitively add in a function. So one of those that I see often are like coalesce. So say, for example, we have like, 5 fields in the final query that need to be like coalesced with the value 0, right? In SQL, this happens all the time where you actually have to do it 5 separate times for, of course, 5 different fields. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and write like a for loop. So we don't have to kind of specify in the coalesce. Now, in this example, there's only 2 fields, but you can see how this kind of scales beyond that. So let's go ahead and do that real quick. And this will, if you're familiar with Python, this will look oddly familiar. So let's go ahead and add that for loop. Before we do that, let's go ahead and create a list. So I'm just going to add these in here once we kind of get back to it. Sorry, that's not right. All right. Typically, if I'm going to set a list, a bunch of values, I'll go ahead and add it to the top. So just so you kind of see it, reading just from top to bottom. So let's go ahead and say set. And let's go ahead and just name it like coalesce list. Something like that. It's going to equal the list of values that we want to coalesce. So right now in the field that I have, what I'm using as part of like the coalesce function, I'm specifying these fields over here. So orders and then total number of items. So let's go ahead and do that. Make sure I spell it right. Cool, looks good. All right, I'm gonna move these down just in case. Just want to make sure we validate that. All right, cool. I'm gonna keep this. All right, so we're gonna initialize the for loop. So let's just say for, we can use I, we can use whatever in coalesce list. Let's do this here. All right, so I is gonna be that value in that list that we created above. So let's go ahead and do that. And then how you kind of like inject the value is by using these kind of like curly brackets, something like this. So you don't have to add spaces, but yeah, this is like the format essentially, kind of like that. Uh, cool. Let's do the same thing over here because we're just going to rename it the same thing. All right. And then, so you might have noticed, you might have not, but you notice that it's not a requirement, but in this instance, but I added initially the alias over here for the CTE orders, right over here. So I'm going to go ahead and add that here as well. Right, so you can see that, okay, when this like compiles, I'll have this function, coalesce. This is a fixed value, so it's going to be like O dot, and then it has the value in that list, comma, and these values are kind of fixed, right? And then it'll as the alias for the field, the value in the list, and that's what we're just going to name it as. All right, cool. For formatting for this, I typically just like to make it like a little bit clear. If not, you can totally just like kind of have it just sit over here. It should be fine. All right. So I think it looks good. Take a double check, make sure everything's spelled out correctly to our knowledge. Make sure it has the apostrophes, quotes up there. Make sure it looks good over here. Okay, cool. We should be good. All right, let's go ahead and save. Cool. And then I'm going to go ahead and compile. That looks good. All right, so this is compiled. All right, sweet. It looks like, well, first of all, it looks like it didn't error out, so that's a good sign. And you can see that it did compile. So here are the values over here. As you can see, like the formatting isn't going to be perfect when it compiles, just naturally, because I use tabs over here, and then you can see that the name of this field is going to be a lot longer than orders. So yes, because it'll look a little bit different, which is okay. All right, cool. And then looks good. So we can go ahead and just get rid of these older columns. Let's go ahead and save. All right, let's go ahead and build. So I select the model. Let's go ahead and do that. Cool. Looks like it built successfully. All right, sweet. So that is one instance of using and implementing Jinja in your DBT project. The other thing that you can do, and there's a lot of other functionality that you can kind of play around with, but the other issue with SQL sometimes it's the same kind of vein, but repetitive bits of code essentially. Especially if you have like multiple CTEs and you kind of have to say, for example, specify a date or specify specific values that you're filtering across all the CTEs. So instead of just having to write it out each and every time, what you can do is like set kind of like a snippet of code. So I'm going to say set, I'm just going to call this filter value. Values make it plural. And then we can kind of like specify the bit of SQL code snippet we want to add, and then we should be good to go. But for this one in particular, we have to kind of end set, right? So you get the sets that you're specifying, and then end set over here. And you can kind of see this is kind of a common theme because down here for the for loop, we had to specify when the for loop ends. So in Python, you just like tab, but in R, right, you have like the curly brackets, like kind of like that. But in this case for Jinja, you have to specify like the end of the for loop. Cool. Set filters and set. All right, we should be good to go. In this case, I'm just going to say like where status not in canceled. Say like there's a case where I had another CT that maybe was like order products or something of that sort where I don't want to also include cancel orders, then I can go ahead and add that bit of snippet that I'm about to create. So let's go ahead and do that here. Multiple ways of going about it. You can probably add the where in here. You can not. I'm just going to add in just the logic. So it just makes it clear what I'm doing up here in the clause specified. So, right, canceled. Oops. Cool. Should be good to go. That looks good. And then let's go ahead and add that in here. So filter values. Cool. Let's go ahead and try compiling this. All right, looks like it compiled successfully. And you can see that I have these filter values over here, which shouldn't be the case because the issue is that I needed to add curly brackets over here. Because my expectation is that instead of where it says filter values in the compiled code, it should actually have this instead right here. All right, let's go ahead and compile it one more time. All right, cool. So, all right, the formatting of it is not ideal, but it does do what we kind of specify where stats not and canceled. You know, what we can do, especially this is like a shorter statement, is that let's go ahead and just like add it to one line. Yeah, I mean, depends upon readability and whatnot for your DBT project, but I think this should be fine. Let's go ahead and just preview, see what that looks like. I mean, we're not going to be able to see the um, order status because that's not added into the file query, but let's just say it, let's just trust it in this case because it compiled. Cool. And then, yeah, same thing. We can build it and then we should be good to go. The other thing I mentioned was creating macros. So let's go ahead and just create like a test macro. So I already created a file called test macro, but so macro, like I was saying before, is kind of like a way to write functions. So this is really useful if you're like bits of code that you want to use kind of across your code base that is a little bit more dynamic. So in this case, you know, some data platforms have this like as a function, but I want like a build out essentially like a function to help like safe divide, right? Because if you just do like a normal division and it has zeros in it, then it's just going to give you an error. So let's go ahead and just create that macro real quick. So you have to say, okay, well, specify it's macro. Safe. I'm going to call this safe divide. This is probably a pretty common example you can see across the internet, but let's go ahead and name the arguments in the function, or I guess macro safe divide. So we got the numerator and then denominator over here. So let's go ahead and say, let's say case when denom. Let's try to keep the formatting the same. Equals 0, then we want it to actually be null. Else Um, you know, and and then you'll start to notice, like I mentioned before, right? To end a macro, we will have to say end macro. Cool. All right, sweet. And then I'm going to go ahead and just rename this what the macro actually is. So this is going to be like a safe divide macro. Safe divide. All right, we should be good to go. All right, so we're going to go ahead and test the macro. Let's go 10 divided by 0. So let's go ahead and use the safe divide macro that we just built. And let's go ahead and just like 10, 5. So 10 will be the numerator for the macro, and then 5 will be the denominator. So in this case, right, we should expect to get the value of 2. Right, 2. All right, and then if we get the denominator and divided by 0, we'll just receive null over here. So that's how you create a macro. Those are just a few ways to implement Jinja into your DBT project and help kind of scale your DBT project more than just writing SQL code. So some issues or limitations that I see, and I've actually done myself, is that so something like this, where sometimes it's a little bit unnecessary to add in some of this logic. Like the for loop for something just for like 2 fields, probably not worth going through the extra effort to add this. It's really easy to add kind of unnecessary complexity into a DBT project. And it's definitely something that I've done before for sure, arguably. The other thing is sometimes it's a little bit less clear when you're defining snippets of code somewhere else, whether it's in here or elsewhere. It makes it a little bit hard to understand when you look at the data model or the data object to see like what's actually really going on. Sometimes you can write some like complicated query with like some complex like Jinja added or like incremental logic that's added, and oftentimes that kind of can get lost in translation as to like what the data model is actually doing. So that's the other thing to consider once you start implementing snippets of this. So it's really just a balance, essentially, a balance between keeping your code dry and the balance of keeping it also like very human readable. So just some food for thought in that perspective. Cool. So that was just my quick intro to DBT Jinja templating and just adding that to your DBT repo. If you like the video, go ahead and subscribe and like. It definitely means a lot. And I'll see you on the next one.